Hi, Mrs. Dickey's kiddos. I miss you and I love you and I can't wait till we can get back together. Some of you have been asking me about To Kill a Mockingbird. We're kind of done with that now, but we didn't get to finish reading it. So I'm going to be recording, reading the chapters each day, so that if you want to go on there and you want to finish the story, I'll just read them to you just like I would in class. So I'm going to start with chapter 16. I don't know where we left off. All that stuff is at school. So I'm going to start with chapter 16. And this is the chapter that's right after Atticus and Dill and Scout and Jem get home from watching Atticus's altercation with the men who came to lynch John Robinson at the jail. So this is when they're coming home. They've gone to bed, um, and but the kids can't sleep. Jim heard me. He thrust his head around the connecting door. As he came to my bed, Atticus's light flashed on. We stayed there where we were until it went off. We heard him turn over and we waited until he was still again. Jim took me to his room and put me in bed beside him. Try to go to sleep, he said. It'll all be over after tomorrow, maybe. We had come in quietly as to not wake Auntie. Atticus killed the engine in the driveway and coasted to the car house. We went to the back door and to our rooms without a word. I was very tired and was drifting into sleep when the memory of Atticus calmly folding the newspaper and pushing back his hat became Atticus standing in the middle of an empty waiting street, pushing up his glasses. The full meaning of the night's events hit me, and I began crying. Jim was awfully nice about it. For once, he didn't remind me that people nearly 9 years old didn't do things like that. Everybody's appetite was delicate that morning, except Jim's. He ate his way through 3 eggs. Atticus watched in frank admiration, and Alexandra sipped coffee and radiated waves of disapproval. Children who slipped out at night were a disgrace to the family. Atticus said he was right glad his disgraces had come along, but Auntie said, nonsense, Mr. Underwood was there the whole time. You know, it's a funny thing about Braxton, said Atticus. He despises Negroes. Won't have one near him. Local opinion held Mr. Underwood to be a very intense, profane little man whose father, in a fey fit of humor, christened Braxton Bragg, a name Mr. Underwood had done his best to live down. Atticus said naming people after Confederate generals made slow, steady drinkers. Calpurnia was serving Aunt Alexandra more coffee, and she shook her head at what I thought was at what I my Kindle's not working. At what I thought was a pleading, winning look. So Scout is begging her to give her coffee. I mean, begging Calpurnia to give her coffee. She's only 9 years old. You're still too little, she said. I'll tell you when you ain't. I said it might help my stomach. All right, she said, and got a cup from the sideboard. She poured 1 tablespoon of coffee into it and filled the cup to the brim with milk. I thanked her by sticking my tongue out at it and looked up to catch Auntie's warning frown, but she was frowning at Atticus. She waited until Calpurnia was in the kitchen, and then she said, "Don't talk like that in front of them." "Talk like what in front of them?" he asked. "Like that in front of Calpurnia. You said Braxton Underwood despises Negroes right in front of her." "Well, I'm sure Cal knows it. Everybody in Maycomb knows it." I was beginning to notice a subtle change in my father these days that came out when he talked with Aunt Alexandra. It was a digging and quiet digging in, never outright irritation. There was a faint starchiness in his voice when he said, "Anything fit to say at the table is fit to say in front of Calpurnia. She knows what she means to this family." "I don't think it's a good habit, Atticus. It's encouraging them. You know how they talk amongst themselves. Everything that happens in this town's out to the quarters before sundown." My father put down his knife. "I don't know of any law that says they can't talk." Maybe if we didn't give them so much to talk about, then they'd be quiet. Why don't you drink your coffee, Scout? Of course, this Atticus is saying, "Why don't you drink your coffee, Scout?" because he knows that Aunt Alexandra would not approve of Scout drinking coffee. So that's kind of like a quiet little dig there. I was playing in it with the spoon. "I thought Mr. Cunningham was a friend of ours. You told me a long time ago he was." "He still is." "But last night he wanted to hurt you." Atticus placed his fork beside his knife and pushed his plate aside. "Mr. Cunningham's basically a good man," he said. "He just has a blind spot along with the rest of us." Jim spoke. "Don't call that a blind spot. He'd have killed you last night when he first went there. He might have hurt me a little, Atticus conceded. But son, you'll understand folks a little better when you're older. A mob's always made up of people no matter what. Mr. Cunningham was part of a mob last night, but he was still a man. Every mob in every little southern town is always made up of people you know. Doesn't say much for them, does it? I'll say not, says Jim. So it took an 8-year-old child to bring him to their senses, didn't it? Said Atticus. That proves something, that a gang of wild animals, oops, sorry, that a gang of wild animals can be stopped simply because they're still human. Maybe we need a police force of children. You children last night made Walter Cunningham stand in my shoes for a minute. That was enough. Well, I hoped Jim would understand folks a little better when he was older. I wouldn't. First day Walter came back to school will be his last, I affirmed. You will not touch him, Atticus said flatly. I don't want either of you bearing a grudge about this thing, no matter what happens. You see, don't you, said Alexandra, what comes of things like this? Don't say I haven't told you. Atticus said he'd never say that, pushed out his chair, and got up. There's a day ahead, so excuse me, Jim. I don't want you and Scout downtown, please. Today, please. So today is when the court case is going to start, and he doesn't want them downtown. But of course, they're not going to listen to him. As Atticus departed, Dill came bounding down the hall into the dining room. It's all over town this morning, he announced, all about how we held off 100 folks with our bare hands. Aunt Alexandra stared at him to silence. It was not 100 folks, she said, and nobody held anybody off. It was just a nest of those Cunninghams, drunk and disorderly. Oh, Auntie, that's just Dill's way, said Jim. He signaled us to follow him. You all stay in the front yard today, she said, as we made our way to the front porch. It was like Saturday. People from the south end of the county passed our house in a leisurely but steady stream. Mr. Dolphus Raymond lurched by on his thoroughbred. Don't see how he stays in the saddle, murmured Jim. How can you stand to get drunk before 8 in the morning? A wagon load of ladies rattled past us. They wore cotton sunbonnets and dresses with long sleeves. A bearded man in a wool hat drove them. Yonder's some Mennonites, Jim said to Dill. They don't have buttons. They live deep in the woods, did most of their trading across the river, and rarely came to Macomb. Dill was interested. They've all got blue eyes, Jim explained, and the men can't shave after they marry. Their wives like for them to tickle them with their beards. Mr. X. Billups rode by on a mule and waved to us. He's a funny man, said Jim. X is his name, not his initial. He was in court one time and they asked him his name. He said X. Billups. Clerk asked him to spell it and he said X. Asked him again and he said X. They kept at it until he wrote X on a sheet of paper and held it up for everybody to see. They asked him where he got his name and he said that's the way his folks signed him up when he was born. As the county went by, Jim gave Dill the histories and general attitudes of the more prominent figures. Mr. Tinsaw Jones voted the straight prohibition ticket. Miss Emily Davis dipped snuff in private. Mr. Byron Waller could play the violin. Mr. Jake Slade was cutting his third set of teeth. So Jim is getting to be kind of like the other adults in the town, where they pretty much know everything about everybody else's business, and so he's filling the young kids in. A wagon load of unusually stern-faced citizens appeared. When they pointed to Miss Maudie Atkins's yard, ablaze with summer flowers, Miss Maudie herself came out to the porch. There was an odd thing about Miss Maudie. On her porch, she was too far away for us to see her features clearly, but we could always catch her mood by the way she stood. She was now standing arms akimbo, her shoulders dropped a little, her head cocked to one side, her glasses winkling in the sunlight, and she wore a grin of the uttermost wickedness. The driver of the wagon slowed down his mules, and a shrill-voiced woman called out, He that cometh in vanity departeth in darkness. Miss Maudie answered, A merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance. I guess that the foot washers thought that the devil was quoting scripture for his own purposes as the driver speeded his mules, so they considered Miss Maudie like the devil. Why they objected to Miss Maudie's yard was a mystery, heightened in my mind because for someone who spent all the daylight hours outdoors, Miss Maudie's command of scripture was formidable. You going to court this morning? Asked Jim. We had strolled over. I am not, she said. I had no business with the court this morning. Aren't you going down to watch? Asked Dill. I am not. It's morbid. Watching a poor devil on trial for his life. Look at all those folks. It's like a Roman carnival. So it's like It is like there's some big, huge festival going on downtown because this court case is huge. And so everybody and their dog is downtown, like waiting to watch this thing. They have to try him in public, Miss Maudie. I said wouldn't be right if they didn't. I'm quite aware of that, she said. Just because it's public, I don't have to go, do I? Miss Stephanie Crawford came by. She wore a hat and gloves. She said. Look at all those folks. You'd think William Jennings Bryan was speaking. And where are you going, Stephanie? Inquired Miss Maudie. To the Jitney Jungle. Miss Maudie said she'd never seen Miss Stephanie go to the Jitney Jungle in a hat in her life. So obviously, Miss Stephanie, who is really, really nosy, is going down to watch the trial. She just doesn't want to admit it. Well, said Miss Stephanie, I thought I might just take a look in at the courthouse to see what Atticus is up to. Better be careful he doesn't hand you a subpoena. We asked Miss Maudie to elucidate. She said that Miss Stephanie seemed to know so much about the case she might as well be called on to testify. We held off until noon when Atticus came home to dinner and said they'd spent the morning picking the jury. After dinner, we stopped by for Dill and went to town. It was a gala occasion. There was no room at the public hitching rail for another animal. Mules and wagons were parked under every available tree. The courthouse square was covered with picnic parties sitting on newspapers, washing down biscuits and syrup with warm milk with fruit jars. Some people were gnawing on cold chicken and cold fried pork chops. The more affluent chased their food with drugstore Coca-Cola in bulb-shaped soda glasses. Greasy-faced children popped the whip through the crowd, and babies lunched at their mothers' breasts. In a far corner of the square, the Negroes sat quietly in the sun, dining on sardines, crackers, and the more vivid flavors of knee-high cola. Mr. Dolphus Raybon sat with them. Jim, said Dill, he's drinking out of a sack. Mr. Dolphus Raymond seemed to be doing so. 2 yellow drugstore straws ran from his mouth to the depths of a brown paper bag. Ain't ever seen anybody do that, murmured Dill. How does he keep what's in it? Jim giggled. He's got a Coca-Cola bottle full of whiskey in there. That's so's not to upset the ladies. You'll see him sip it all afternoon. He'll step out for a while and fill it back up. Why is he sitting with the colored folks? Always does. He likes them better than he likes us, I reckon. Lives by himself way down near the county line. He's got a colored woman and all sorts of mixed children. Some of them show you some of them if we see him. He doesn't look like trash, said Dill. He's not, said Jim. He owns all of one side of the riverbank down there, and he's from a real old family to boot. Then why does he do like that? It's just his way, said Jim. They say he never got over his wedding. He was supposed to marry one of the spender ladies, I think. They were going to have a huge wedding, but they didn't. After the rehearsal, the bride went upstairs and blew her head off. Shotgun. She pulled the trigger with her toes. Did they ever know why? No, said Jim. Nobody ever knew quite why but Mr. Dolphus. They said it was because she found out about his colored woman. He reckoned he could keep her and get married, too. He's been sort of drunk ever since. You know, though, he's real good to those children. Jim, I asked, what's a mixed child? Half white, half colored. You've seen him, Scout. You know that red, kinky-headed one that delivers for the drugstore? He's half white. They're real sad. Sad? How come? They don't belong anywhere. Colored folks won't have them because they're half white. White folks won't have them because they're colored. So they're just in-betweens. Don't belong anywhere. But Mr. Dolphus now, they say he shipped 2 of his up north. They don't mind him up north. Yonder's one of them. A small boy clutching a Negro woman's hand walked towards us. He looked all Negro to me. He was rich chocolate with flaring nostrils and beautiful teeth. Sometimes he would sip happily, and the Negro woman tugged his hand to make him stop. No, said Jim. Oh, sorry. Jim waited until they passed us. That's one of the little ones, he said. How can you tell? Asked Dill. He looked black to me. You can't sometimes, not unless you know who they are. But he's half Raymond, all right. But how can you tell? I asked. I told you, Scout. You just have to know who they are. Well, how do you know we ain't Negroes? Uncle Jack Finch says we really don't know. He says as far as he can trace back the Finches we ain't, but for all he knows, we might have come straight out of Ethiopia during the Old Testament. Well, if we came out during the Old Testament, it's too long ago to matter. That's what I thought, said Jim. But around here, once you have a drop of Negro blood, that makes you all black. Hey, look! Some invisible signal had made the lunchers on the square rise and scatter bits of newspaper, cellophane, and wrapping paper. Children came to mothers. Babies were cradled on hips as men in sweat-stained hats collected their families and herded them through the courthouse doors. In the far corner of the square, the Negroes and Mr. Dolphus Raymond stood up and dusted their breeches. There were a few men and children among them, which seemed to dispel the holiday mood. They waited patiently at the doors behind the white families. Let's go in, said Dill. No, we better wait till they get in. Atticus might not like it if he sees us, said Jim. The Macomb County Courthouse was faintly reminiscent of Arlington in one respect. The concrete pillars supporting its south roof were too heavy for their light burden. The pillars were all that remained standing when the original courthouse burned in 1856. Another courthouse was built around them. It's better to say built in spite of them. But for the south porch, the Macomb County Courthouse was early Victorian, presenting an unoffensive vista when seen from the north. From the other side, however, Greek revival columns clashed with a big 19th century clock tower housing a rusty, unreliable instrument, a view indicating a people determined to preserve every physical scrap of past. So it's like a whole bunch of different time periods all in one building, depending on which way you looked at the building. To reach the courtroom on the second floor, one passed sundry sunless county cubbyholes. That's hard to say. One passed sundry sunless county cubbyholes. The tax assessor, the tax collector, the county clerk, the county solicitor, the circuit clerk, the judge of the probate lived in cool, dim hutches that smelled of decaying record books mingled with old damp cement and stale urine. Ooh. It was necessary to turn on the lights in the daytime. There was always a film of dust on the rough floorboards. The inhabitants of these offices were creatures of their environment, little gray faced men that seemed untouched by wind or sun. That sounds like a horrible way to work. We knew there was a crowd, but we had not bargained for the multitudes in the first floor hallway. I got separated from Jim and Dill, but made my way toward the hall by the stairwell, knowing Jim would come for me eventually. I found myself in the middle of the Idlers Club and made myself as unobtrusive as possible. This was a group of white shirted, khaki trousered, suspendered old men who had spent their lives doing nothing and passed their twilight days doing the same on pine benches under the live oaks in the square. Um, Attentive critics of courthouse business, Atticus said they knew as much of the law as the Chief Justice from long years of observation. So these old men, this was their form of entertainment. They would get all dressed up and they would go sit in the courthouse and watch the court cases. And really, that's probably the only people that watched them. They weren't used to having all these people there. So these old guys are kind of perturbed that all of these people are coming and taking over their um, daytime activity. Normally, they were the court's only spectators, but today they seemed resentful of the interruption of their comfortable routine. When they spoke, their voices sounded casually important. The conversation was about my father. Thinks he knows what he's doing, one said. Oh, now I wouldn't say that, said the other. Atticus Finch is a deep reader, a mighty deep reader. He reads all right. That's all he does, the club snickered. So they're laughing about her dad, and she's listening. Let me tell you something now, Billy, a third man said. You know the court appointed him to defend this Negro. Yeah, but Atticus aims to defend him. That's what I don't like about it. So what they don't like is not that he's defending him because he kind of has to because he's the, the defendant attorney, but that he wants to, that he's like taking it seriously and he wants to defend him. They don't like that. This was news that put a different light on things. Atticus had to, whether he wanted to or not. I thought it odd that he hadn't said anything about it to us. We would have used it many times in defending him and ourselves. He had to. That's why he was doing it. Equaled fewer fights and less fussing. But did that explain the town's attitude? The court appointed Atticus to defend him. Atticus aimed to defend him. That's why they didn't like about it. It was so confusing. The Negroes, having waited for the white people to go upstairs, began to come in. Whoa, now, just a minute, said a club member, holding up his walking stick. Don't just start up them stairs. Don't start up them there stairs yet a while. The club began its stiff-jointed climb and ran into Dill and Jim on the way down looking for me. They squeezed past and Jim called, Scout, come on. There ain't a seat left. We have to stand up. Look a there now, he said irritably as the black people surged upstairs. The old men ahead of them would take most of the standing room. We were out of luck and it was all my fault, Jim informed me. We stood miserably by the wall. Can't you all get in? Reverend Sykes was looking down at us, black hat in hand. Hey, Reverend, said Jim. Nah, Scout here messed us up. Well, let's see what we can do. Reverend Sykes edged his way upstairs. In a few moments, he was back. There's not a seat downstairs. Do y'all reckon it'll be all right if y'all come in the balcony with me? Remember, Reverend Sykes is the reverend who was the preacher at Calpurnia's church. Gosh, yes, said Jim. Happily, we sped ahead of Reverend Sykes to the courtroom floor. There we went up a covered staircase and waited at the door. Reverend Sykes came puffing behind us and steered us gently through the black people in the balcony. 4 Negroes rose and gave us their front row seats. The colored balcony ran along 3 walls of the courtroom like a second story veranda, and from it we could see everything. The jury sat to the left under long windows, sunburned, lanky. They seemed to be all farmers, but this was natural. Townfolk rarely sat on juries. They were either struck or excused. One or two of the jury looked vaguely like dressed-up Cunninghams. At this stage, they sat straight and alert. The circuit solicitor and another man, Atticus, and Tom Robinson, sat at tables with their backs to us. There was a brown book and some yellow tablets on the solicitor's table. Atticus's was bare, so Atticus didn't bring anything with him today. Just inside the railing that divided the spectators from the court, the witnesses sat on cowhide bottom chairs. Their backs were to us. Judge Taylor was on the bench looking like a sleepy old shark, his pilot fish riding rapidly below in front of him. So the court reporter's like down there writing really fast. Judge Taylor looked like most judges I'd ever seen. Amiable, white-haired, slightly ruddy-faced. He was a man who ran his court with an alarming informality. He sometimes propped his feet up, and he often cleaned his fingernails with his pocket knife. In long equity hearings, especially after dinner, he gave the impression of dozing, an impression dispelled forever when a lawyer once deliberately pushed a pile of books to the floor in a desperate effort to wake him up. Without opening his eyes, Judge Taylor murmured, "Mr. Whitley, do that again and it'll cost you $100. He was a man learned in the law, and although he seemed to take his job casually, in reality he kept a firm grip on any proceedings that came before him. Only once was Judge Taylor ever seen in a dead standstill in open court, and the Cunninghams stopped him. Old Sarum, their stomping grounds, was populated by 2 families, separate and apart in the beginning, but unfortunately bearing the same name. The Cunninghams married the Conninghams until the spelling of the names was academic until a Cunningham disputed a Conningham over land titles and took it to the law. During a controversy of this character, Jeans Cunningham testified that his mother spelled it Cunningham on deeds and things, but she was really a Conningham. She was an uncertain speller, a seldom reader, and was given to looking far away sometimes when she sat on the front gallery in the evening. After 9 hours of listening to the eccentricities of Old Sarum's inhabitants, Judge Taylor threw the case out of court. When asked upon what grounds, Judge Taylor said, "Champertus connivance," and declared he hoped to God the litigants were satisfied by each having had their public say. They were. That was all they'd wanted in the first place. Judge Taylor had one interesting habit. He permitted smoking in his courtroom, but did not himself indulge. Sometimes, if one was lucky, one had the privilege of watching him put a long, dry cigar into his mouth and munch it slowly up. Bit by bit, the dead cigar would disappear, to reappear some hours later as a flat, slick mess. I'm going to throw up. Its essence extracted and mingling with Judge Taylor's digestive juices. I once asked Atticus how Mrs. Taylor stood to kiss him, but Atticus said they didn't kiss much. The witnesses' stand was to the right of Judge Taylor, and when we got to our seats, Mr. Heck Tate was already on it. So, it's fixing to start. So, Heck Tate, which is the sheriff, is going to be the first person to testify. Tomorrow, I'll read chapter 17 and put it on there. That was 16, so I'm not sure where your class left off, but if you're interested, you can come on here and finish listening to the story. I love you guys, and I'll see you on Zoom on Tuesday. Bye.